This conversation was sponsored by Komodo, a zero-knowledge, peer-to-peer atomic swap exchange. Learn more at komodoplatform.com. Where do you see crypto in 10 to 15 years?
Long term, crypto is going to radically transform every part of our world, simply because so much of our world has become centralized. You know, with the walled gardens, with our government, with the corporate structures and so forth, that there's blockchain as a whole is empowering people to decentralize things, to democratize our entire civilization all over again. And I talked about this in my talk at Fourth Block the other night, was that the first industrial revolution created a lot of these factory cities and company towns where you had machine party politics and built these patron-client relationships that were really inimical to civil society. So rather than you and me relating in an egalitarian fashion in a company town, it would matter who's the boss and who's the employee, and what favors can they do, and if you want to keep your job, you're going to vote for the right candidate and that sort of thing. And then in the second industrial revolution, which was like the automobiles and flight and so forth, it enabled people to be a lot more mobile, have greater geographic mobility, more democratization of wealth, but at the cost of having more regulation in government, unionized workplaces, and that sort of thing. So you still had a different sort of centralization going on. And then with the information revolution, which is the third industrial revolution, you had the walled gardens come in with AOL and these other companies where they're turning people into information chattel, where they're controlling and owning our identity and selling our data. And I think that we're getting to the point now with blockchain where we can use it to really decentralize all of these different power structures, whether it's political parties, whether it's centralized governments, regulatory systems, going to online communities. They can all be decentralized. And particularly with government, because that's the most decentralized power structures in the world today, we're seeing issues with, for instance, the fiscal sustainability of governments like the U.S. government, like Europe, and so on and so forth, China. We have these huge baby boom generations that are starting to retire and putting increasing strain on their retirement systems, their welfare systems. And just the U.S. alone, not counting the cost of Obamacare, the U.S. has $120 trillion in unfunded liabilities in the coming 20, 30 years. And they have no clue how to pay for it. I mean, even at 100% tax rates and 100% confiscation in inheritance taxes, there's nowhere near enough money that they can steal to pay for all those things. They could restabilize things by radically changing legislation, like changing the retirement age to the life expectancy. But it's completely politically untenable. There's too many voters out there who would refuse to accept that kind of change. But we can decentralize government with blockchain to make it fiscally sustainable again. We can, starting with the more unstable governments, but eventually to our own, is to have, for instance, we could convert the dollar to a crypto dollar and have a national blockchain that the crypto dollar is on that allows for government to decentralize its functions as smart contracts on the national blockchain, so that people can directly interact with the national blockchain for their governance needs on a voluntary basis. And then for things like entitlements benefits, whether it's unemployment, Social Security, welfare, Medicare, government pensions, all of these sort of benefits that are cost centers that are the source of these unfunded liabilities can be turned into profit centers by enabling people seeking these benefits to upskill into 21st century capabilities by mining the national blockchain. And this is one of the reasons we are pioneering the proof of participation on the galactic coin is national blockchains can implement proof of participation, so that to mine the national blockchain, you have to be a citizen of that nation. And so therefore it's limiting who can participate in mining. It makes it more profitable, while as the more you decentralize more functions of the government, it monetizes more of that mining activity. So the point where right now there's a lot of calls in various circles for universal basic income, but they really don't know how to fund it. But you can do that with blockchain-based government decentralization.
So it would be something like Dash is, the budget system, where some of that money would be consistently going to identified wallets that have been through an implementation of proof of participation. They united with sort of a personal ID, right?
Yep.
Government sort of vetted ID, and then they can deliver that money. But just to clarify, like proof of participation is not in Galactic Coin is not it's not a biometrics thing. It's more like a sort of identity of the individual character that you're creating in a game.
Where you're using it, if you've got to be logged into one of these virtual reality platforms.
So it's an identity system that's cross-platform, but it's sort of pseudonymous. And, right.
But the idea is promoting this as something where you can, it's without having to have a permission system, you can still limit the participation to a select group of people. So that, for instance, for this, you would have citizens can mine the national blockchain. So you won't have, one country's entire welfare budget going to data centers in China. So, which would make it an untenable situation. So this sort of situation is going to make governments fiscally sustainable again.
They're going to have to, right? Because they're going to be competing against...
there's really no way for them to survive the coming years with the technological singularity, with the retirement of the baby boomers. And with blockchain, people are going to be able to offer so many different blockchain services that'll directly compete against government, so that they'll have the choices. And so with national blockchains, people will gradually, as more and more of their governance needs become smart contracts, they'll become more and more comfortable with blockchains as a standard part of their culture and society and economic activity. Then you can start to look at the question of, just like people do with health insurance now, with health insurance portability, why do I need to use this blockchain just because I live at this address? And so then we can really get to a situation where we can have a public debate locally and globally of whether we must be in a monocentric governance system like we have now, or whether we can shift to a polycentric governance system where I can choose what governance needs I want satisfied by choosing what blockchains I want to participate in. So then the different national blockchains, if it doesn't matter what geography you're in, then they have to compete against each other in providing the best level of service to the users.
In relative to the environmental sort of local pressures and needs and culture of what's happening. So there's going to be a lot of market, I think, competition in that, a lot of market variability. One of the areas of speculation in this is that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are going to make governments obsolete in some way. I'm not sure that I completely buy that. In fact, I think we're starting to see Venezuela. I think Venezuela is an excellent case study for the power of Bitcoin and power of cryptocurrencies. And I think we're going to be seeing, I've been hearing some things that we're going to see Venezuela tax miners, Bitcoin miners, and that's actually beneficial in a sense to Bitcoin miners, because that means that they can have a government guarantee of security against petty crime as well as
they're already
government
being
crime.
Taxed by Venezuelan cops who are basically taking bribes to not arrest them.
Yeah.
So this is more of systematizing it and protecting them against being taxed by multiple cops.
So it protects them, like at least gives them some path to be protected from corruption, as well as from petty crime. And like talking to some Venezuelan miners in Colombia, they're like, yeah, this is really great for us. Like we're perfectly fine giving the government 20% of our profits, as long as we can keep mining and making a shit ton of money. Right. And so Venezuela is a very extreme case because the Bolivian peso is just going, Bitcoin is going up, right? And so makes it's very profitable to mine there, and electricity is free, right? And so so we'll see how that happens. I think that we may. Do you see some of that happening in other countries? The taxation of miners and stuff.
I think that there's going to be increasing acceptance by a number of government, both in the idea I was talking about with national blockchains, as well as acceptance and taxation of miners, particularly in countries where people are recognizing that the cryptocurrency is more trustable than their own government.
Right.
And so this is something where the governments are actually going to have to step up and provide a better level of service. If they're going to tax it, people would wonder, why should I pay a tax to a government I don't trust to be able to use the money I do trust?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. By separating money and state, it's actually potentially, like, it could bring back down the size of government back to its original, at least in the United States, its original purpose, which was the security of the sort of civilians, and that's it. She agrees with me. She came here to give us a hug.
Have a seat. Sit, Ginger. Can you sit?
All right.
Have a seat. Come on, lie down. Lie down. Lie down.
Hola.
You sticking your butt in my face? Is that a signal?
You're trying to tell us something. What's her name again?
Ginger.
Ginger.
Come on, lie down. Lie down. Yes, there you go. Lie down. Yeah, you.
Here, I'll help you with the leg.
There we go. Good girl. All right, now we can continue.
Yeah. So it may be like it's going to limit governments fiscally, and it's going to, as cryptocurrency start to serve certain governance needs. The people are going to have to start being more fiscally responsible just because of the reality of the market. Because there's always going to be an option to sell your crypto and buy Bitcoin and hold it. So the value of fiat currencies are going to keep going down, and you can't play the political games that you can play right now.
And I think that, as libertarians and crypto anarchists and anarcho-capitalists, we need to have a bit more of a realistic view of how this adoption is going to play out. Because, a lot of us, we were fans of fiction in the 90s, of books like Snow Crash and Ready Player One and so forth. And like Snow Crash in particular predicted a society where there'd be a post-federal society where the government collapsed because it couldn't collect taxes because everybody was using a cryptocurrency online to avoid them. And that was sort of one of the dreams. Snow Crash was one of the favorite books among myself and a lot of these other guys that, cypherpunks. And so, that was kind of the future we were all hoping for. But I think that with the slow adoption of broadband, and as long as it's taken to get cryptocurrency adopted, it's given government the time to play catch up and it was natural to notice that they would develop tools to counteract that and in some ways co-opt the technology. So we need to not assume that a technology is going to just make government obsolete, because government is just as capable of using a technology as individuals. And I like to think that most technologies are inherently empowering the individual more than they are government, but at the same time, the government still has a lot of ability to mobilize technology faster than markets often do. And so we need to be cognizant of that and accept that, governments aren't going to disappear overnight. And, we can encourage them to do better, be better governments, downsizing, and provide better services that through, the consensus and authentication tools in blockchain. But to assume that they're just going to disappear overnight is a bit naive.
Yeah.
And part of me is disappointed at myself coming to that realization, but it's something that I think that people need to accept. And we all want to live in a just society, and we have different ideas of what that means. And some of us think that a just society is a society with no government, but to a lot of people, the idea of not having a government providing certain guarantees and protection isn't a just society. If you're not guaranteed that your contracts are going to be enforced, that doesn't sound like a just society. If you can't trust that private arbitrators are going to act fairly, then you don't see as a just society. And a lot of us think that a market for dispute resolution does provide more just solutions. But, and we're trying to create the tools that enable us to demonstrate that. But we have to demonstrate it. We have to with ICOs, we need to create a community of understanding that we're still responsible for creating the tools for ICOs to not be scams.
Yeah.
Creating an industry self-regulating organization so that the SEC won't be encouraged to come in and in a draconian manner impose their own regulations. Because in government agencies really, despite what a lot of us think, don't have the first trigger to regulate something. They actually do tend to look at industries to self-regulate first. And it's only when industries refuse to do so that they're able to build the political will to develop regulations to bring industry to bear. And so...
Yeah, this is a fascinating area that we were talking a little bit about it earlier today. And it's... I've sort of written somewhat and talked about the need for go to self-regulated ICOs and for us to develop tools for it. Because in a sense, if we don't try to self-regulate, we are validating the SEC's argument or the regulator's argument that we are not of good intent. We need to demonstrate good intent by self-regulating and self-restraining and calling out the scams, or at least.
Ginger, just chill out.
Or at least not promoting scams.
Yeah, and there's a lot of valid arguments that blockchains are themselves self-regulating because the way that smart contracts work. And yes, that's true, but at the same time, the actors in the industry are not self-regulating. Humans are still going to be humans no matter what, and there's still going to be people trying to
scam other people, or find holes.
And that's where you really need to, as long as we create standards for the smart contracts to ensure that scammers aren't able to scam, and then the community, the public holds ICOs to task saying you're not meeting these standards, then we can basically motivate the market to say we're not going to fund these ICOs because they're not meeting these standards.
Right.
And then that's going to tell agencies like the SEC that they don't need to regulate because we're already doing it.
Yeah, and so let's talk a little bit about some options that people that want to launch an ICO have regarding self-regulation. I think one of the best models that I've seen is doing capped ICOs, where you say we only want to raise $5 million or $10 million or $500,000. We're not going to accept any more money than this, and we may sort of reserve the right in the future to do a second wave of ICO once we reach certain goals. Right. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to say we're going to raise as much money as we can get, but we're going to lock 20% into this smart contract, with this escrow, which is a little more complicated, with this escrow party, and they'll be released if we release this particular, we should reach this particular milestone. And there's also sort of apparently still exploration of the DAO model, where you're trying to replicate a corporate structure through equity ownership where you can enforce sort of majority equity decisions on the movement of this sort of treasury funds. And that's probably, I think that's probably going to happen within the area of the space that's doing SEC compliant ICOs, where you get KYC AML, so you have that legal kind of ecosystem within that ecosystem, and then it'll probably emerge from that, and then at some point maybe we can start breaking away from that with more confidence from the SEC and stuff like that.
Yeah, and you really need to prove that you're acting in good faith to be able to justify to the SEC that they don't need to use existing regulations. I mean, what a lot of us are doing right now is if we're going to do an equity token ICO, we recognize that an equity token is a security. We admit it up front. And we're not trying to hide behind various structures or foundations or whatever, because it's really not, in my opinion, really ethical, even though it's legal. And you can definitely get lawyers to tell you this is perfectly legal to do, and so on and so forth. But I wonder how, if people really understood these sort of structures to legally avoid the regulatory regime, how confident they would be in those blockchains. And so, we basically took the problem head up front, and we said, we're going to, we're Americans, we're incorporated here, we're offering equity, we want people to have equity in our company, so we're going to comply with the SEC regulations, with Regulation D and so forth. So we're doing this all by the book. And by showing that ICO companies doing equity offerings are doing things by the book, then we can say to the SEC, listen, we're operating in good faith to comply with the existing regulations, but really your existing regulations kind of suck. For instance, the whole accredited investor rules is, it's ostensibly meant to, quote, protect the consumer or individual investor. But the fact is it really only protects them by not allowing to participate at all. So you've got to be $250,000 in income, $2 million in assets,
which is very few people in the world.
Very few people. There's I think 16 million millionaires in the United States, 15 million millionaires, and
talk about oligopoly. There's an oligopoly, right?
And to reach 2 million, you're dealing with less than half of that. So the population of investors who are allowed to participate in these private equity placements is really restricted. And number one, that limits. Ginger, lie down. Sit your butt.
Yeah, sit down. Sit down,
sit.
girl.
Come on, sit. You can do it. Sit.
Hola. Well, girl.
Are you becoming a camera fiend, huh?
She's liking the attention.
So, as I was saying, it limits the size of the capital markets for private equity, and it excludes people from it, so it's not really protecting them, and it limits people's ability to gain upward mobility socioeconomically through investment, and so that's not protecting people either. That's creating stratification in our society, and so I would argue that once we comply with this process, one of the things we would do is go to the SEC and say, we're operating legally, we're good faith players here, but we would like to see modification of the accredited investor rules. We would like to have it be income in a progressive income base, so that if you are, let's say you're earning, $2,000 a month, you can risk up to $200 a month on investments in private equity. You can't do any more. If you're making $3,000 a month, you can do $300. So that way you have
fully collateralized sort of.
So, well, it's a matter of scaling how much risk a person can take based on their income. That scales with income rather than being just this hard cap at a very high level. And I think that really one of the reasons for this current rule for the accredited investor is that it's not really intended to protect consumers. It's intended to protect elite investors from competing against a lot of smaller investors for private equity placements. And I think that if we change the rule to have this scaling function in how much risk you could take based on income, you would see a lot more IPOs, a lot more ICOs getting funded with a lot more capital without having to put as much equity at risk as for sale to the public.
And giving buyers a lot more rights, legal rights over equity and company and all that.
And the price of that equity would rise because of increased demand. So you would have really a renaissance in capital markets, and you would have a whole lot more people in the country who would be gaining wealth through capital investment, and they don't need to be personally investing themselves in making the decisions, utilizing mutual funds and other pool systems like that to allow professionals to make their investment decisions for them. It's perfectly fine, but you want to be able to allow more people to participate in private equity markets and not leave it as a private rigged game for a small class of venture capitalists and their accredited investor clients.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fascinating topic to explore. And I have to say, like, the SEC does seem to have acted in a very kind of cautious way. It doesn't seem like they are acting in a predatory manner, and it does look like they're going after scammy behavior. So, kudos to them for that. I think it's important to recognize that there does seem to be some goodwill in them, even though we need to, I think, challenge some of the assumptions that have led to the current rules, right, and the current sort of laws, right?
A lot of people assume wrongly that the SEC is a government agency. It's not. They have, just like the ASPCA and the Humane Society have government authority to go on your property and make sure your pets are being properly treated. The SEC has congressional authority it's an industry self-regulating organization. That's how it started.
Oh, shit.
And so, but it was delegated some enforcement capability by Congress. So people get confused and think that it's a government agency when it's not. And so really, if we have people acting in good faith, if the community creates a similar self-regulating organization, then it's going to be something where instead of having the SEC come down, if the SEC doesn't understand blockchain, if we have a blockchain commission of some form that's made up by people in the industry to create standards for ICOs, to create standards for smart contracts and all these sort of things, then Congress will say, you're doing a good job. Here's the imprimatur. You can you have the authority to do this across the entire marketplace. And so that way, anybody who wants to be in blockchain can participate in the regulatory process, can vote on commissioners, to nominate for appointment to the commission, things like that. So this is where I kind of part ways with a lot of the more I call the bunkertarian kind of faction of the liberty movement, that they don't want to be involved at all. They think that I call it the Freddy Krueger fallacy, that if you don't believe in something, that it doesn't have power over you. And and so the fact is the government can hurt you, and a lot of libertarians don't believe in voting. I vote. I participate in creating legislation. I vote self-defensively, just like I carry a gun when I'm in a dark alley. In a dark election, I vote self-defensively. And that's as much, people say that there's three boxes in civil society. There's the ballot box, the jury box, and the bullet box. Okay? And those are really your three powers as a citizen to change your government. And the system isn't fully corrupted. And the only reason it's really corrupted is because people refuse to be involved. And we've really proven that with the Free State Project in New Hampshire, that you get enough Liberty people who are dedicated to making change happen, to participating in the process, to ensuring transparency in the political process, and voting, getting elected, creating legislation, and you can actually change the course of events in your political system. So
politics is downstream from culture.
Yeah.
Yep. Andrew Breitbart said that, by the way. We're going to catch that. I think it's a really interesting premise, and it does seem to follow. Yeah. I mean, I've become perfectly fine with the idea of defensive voting. I think sometimes it's going to make sense to use this tool, and to refuse to use a particular power that you have in order to defend what you think is good it's a weak move that you're going to end up losing ground on.
The argument that voting is always an initiation of aggression is simply false. I mean, it's just like I like to poke fun at some libertarians who, for some reason, automatically assume any use of force is an aggression, and it's not. If I'm defending myself, I'm using force to defend myself. I'm not initiating an aggression. And the non-aggression principle only applies to initiations of aggression. So just like self-defense is valid use of force, self-defensive voting is valid use of the vote.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of new ones that I find kind of, I don't even know what to call them. It's like a particular branch of anarcho-capitalists. And it's a particularly ADD branch of ODD. Yeah.
Oppositional defiant disorder.
ODD and autistic sort of branch of the anarcho-capitalist movement that just, it seems like they can't see that, the nuance in that, right? Like, self-defense is a form of violence, but the only difference is sort of a kind of, cause and effect
right. You're justified because you've been aggressed against it, right?
Yeah. And then there's like this whole spectrum of ethics within fraud that I don't see any sort of anarchist philosopher discussing at depth, except the people that are in the crypto market thinking about ICOs and being like, shit, there's a lot of scams going on, right?
And this is actually really healthy for libertarianism in general, is to have this debate because of cryptocurrency is to what is fraud. Is fraud an initiation of aggression? Yes. And, it's misrepresentation, it's theft, it's, all kinds of wrongdoing. And so therefore we're starting to have this sort of conversation in the liberty community and saying, these sort of behaviors, even though there's, aren't guns involved, people aren't dying or being injured physically, they're being injured monetarily. If we agree as libertarians that the basis of our rights in nature is based on our self-ownership, and that all rights are property rights, then it doesn't matter whether it's my property right to a vote or property right to my home or property right to my person, any such aggression violating any right is a violation of my property rights, and therefore is a tortious aggression that should be opposed by libertarians.
Yeah. And I hope that this serves as an invitation to libertarian academics and philosophers to come in and really enter the space and try to help develop this sort of legal theory, or at least sort of consensus legal theory, or whatever we're going to call it. Because I don't see them, I don't hear them. So if you find this interesting, share it with them. Go share it in their forums. Go tell them about it. Because it's clearly like an important issue in the market, right? And if we don't find the proper solution to it, and as a self-regulating sort of community, then the SEC is going to come in and have to make some decisions,
Right.
right?
If you don't just the whole basis of government is because people are not responsible. If you're not regulating your own behavior, that's irresponsibility. And government's mantra is that people are no good and they need to be told what to do, and because they're not responsible. If you don't want government in your life, the best way to get government out of your life is to be responsible for yourself.
Absolutely.
And that's where you get the rubber meets the road between regulation of self-regulation and government regulation. So if you don't want Uncle Sugar in your life, if you don't want the welfare state, if you don't want the tyrant in your life, then you need to be responsible for your behavior and how you deal with other people, how you treat other people, and how you behave in your contractual relations. And that's really the basis of libertarianism there.
Yeah, and do it consistently and spread it to your community and work to make that grow at a scale where governments will have to sort of recognize that they're in the bad.
It's like the difference,
because governments are made of people, right?
Yeah.
If people can't justify to themselves, right? Yeah, there's sociopaths in every group, but they're a very small part of it, right? If people identify the sociopaths and if people can't justify their own behavior against other people, then that behavior won't happen.
Right.
And that's how the de-escalation.
And statists always try to justify what they're doing by pointing at the bad actors. But the fact is that you've got bad actors, anarchists, and you got bad actor statists, and really, with one can't survive without the other, justifying each other's existence.
Brilliant. Yeah, from like a pure strategy perspective, it makes sense that there's an alignment between the two sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah. The negative
So,
actors on both sides.
the you're not the boss of me. There's a difference between chaos and anarchy, and the state loves to always equate the two to give anarchy a bad name. But the fact is that and this is where you get between libertarianism and libertinism, is that being free to do anything doesn't mean you should do anything. That's the difference. Just because it's an anarchy doesn't mean you need to make it a chaotic system.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. So for anarchy, like the ideal of the anarchist society or the anarcho-capitalist society to emerge, people need to become conscious enough and responsible enough over themselves and their family and their environment, so that they can bring order in from the chaos from the individual instead of having to deal with an imposition.
Spontaneous order is an emergent property of a voluntary society, and that's
there's a kind of spiritual or cultural sort of responsibility and ethic that people need to sort of
and
function under.
We had a similar discussion on Free Talk Live last week, where from a religious perspective, people talk about you need the church to be the state to tell people what to do, and it's like, no, the idea of a religious relationship with a higher power is that you're trying to live a virtuous life, and by doing so, you're whether it's earning a place in heaven or just having a better life, a happier life, more at peace with people. It doesn't really matter what the end goal is, but the state telling you how to behave actually prevents a virtuous society, because if you don't have the freedom to choose to act virtuously, then you're being prevented from living virtuously, because being told what to do isn't a credit to you, because you're not the one that made that decision. The state made the decision to tell you what to do. So you have no gain. You didn't earn anything by behaving. But if you are free to choose to behave that way, to in a voluntary society, to comply with accepted standards of a moral system, of an ethical system, then you're going to be seen as virtuous by others. You'll be seen as a fair actor by others. More people will want to deal with you, and you'll benefit personally from that. And whether you have a spiritual component of an idea of a reward in hereafter or whatever, that's great too.
Yeah, and the courage, like there's in civil disobedience against sort of this sort of more totalitarian or authoritarian rulings. There's sort of the courage emerges, and from that there's heroism, right? You're bringing virtue into existence through civil disobedience, right? And that's definitely a very
not by
honorable thing.
avoiding consequences. If you're going to be being a civil disobedient protester, you have to accept the consequences that the state may impose on you. You can't try to escape. Okay, be hiding out in the jungle or escaping to another country. You're not earning virtue by doing that. And you're not helping your cause as much as you could by standing up to the power and, like the Christians in the amphitheater being torn apart by the lions, you're not showing the people, your tormentors, how wrong they are by forcing them to do their worst to you. Okay? If you're escaping it, you're not teaching them that lesson.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good argument, and I think it's a difficult one to deal with. I mean, to some degree, like I have some friends that were simply, they escaped the United States at a given time for fear out of, the certain things that the government would impose on their children.
Right.
And so there's certain lines that I can respect and say, okay, well, fuck, that's a difficult choice, but I can certainly see the courage in staying and fighting and sort of pushing
right.
back. And
when you've got kids involved, you've actually got to make you people often say the societies practice the morals they can afford. And when you're having a family, you can't just think about the risk to your own person. You have to think about it to your spouse and your kids and so forth. So that's can be a moral hazard you have to really walk through, and so people can't afford to take that sort of moral stand if they have these other obligations to other people. So it is a difficult choice to make.
Right on. All right, we're almost at 3 hours. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, not really. This has been a great show and great to chat with you about this. But a great time to have you here, and I hope we do more hangouts in the future and different events around the world.
Absolutely. I think it was a fascinating conversation. Let us know what you guys think in the comments below. Share it. Tell everybody you like it. And thank you for having me here. It's been a great time in New York, and looking forward to doing more.
Thanks for coming up.
More podcasts and shows and stuff. Cool. Also, check out his tie. It's hilarious. This is what a lot of the crypto noobs are experiencing in this Bitcoin crash.
Ooh, roller coaster. Oh, no. This is actually a tie I wear to all the weddings in my family. So
they're like...
Oh, no. And this is like, there's only been one wedding in my family that I've worn this to that hasn't ended in divorce. So this is sort of the jinx tie. So everybody's like, you're not wearing that to my wedding. And I'm like, okay.
The jinx tie. That's really funny. Well, I hope more people stop getting divorced. Divorce is a bad thing. Have some grit, for fuck's sakes. Or don't marry. I don't know. People you might
marry
divorce.
More people. Polytheistic or poly marriages. So.
All right, we'll have to leave that discussion for another time. Take care, guys.
And so by having sensors all along that, those are all addressable IP objects in the Internet of Things.
We humans, and we mortal humans in the Dash community are basically helping the gears that move it, that we can fall away and this thing will continue.
Look at the gold market. You'd have to look at how many ounces of gold are being pulled out of the ground each month, not just how much gold is being